was talking to a newly licensed ham a few weeks ago, and we got talking about 160 metres, and although he was aware of the 160 metre band, he'd never listened to it because he hadn't got any antennas, and he said, how easy is it to get onto the 160 metre band? Because I was explaining to him that when I was first licensed, the 160 metre band was the band that many of us cut our teeth on. It was the band that you began your ham radio career on, and then you sort of went on from there. Well, I thought, yeah, it's an interesting question actually. How easy is it to get onto 160 metres these days? So let's take a look.
Welcome to the Waters and Stanton Ham Radio channel, presented by Peter Waters.
Well, like many hams of my vintage, I started my career in ham radio on 160 metres. It was the recognised band to go to. It was a band that you could natter to local hams, club members, etc, etc. One thing about 160 metres is it's got very good ground wave. So ground wave extends around about 20-25 miles or so. You get some very good local contacts, not unlike 2 metres I suppose. Compare it with 7 megs where the ground wave doesn't extend more than about a couple of miles or so. Once the station's further than a couple of miles away, you start to lose them. But 160 metres has got good ground wave, so it means to say that it's quite a good band to natter on. And when darkness falls, it's an interesting band. You can work some interesting DX, you can work into Europe quite easily. And if you're well equipped and you're on at the right time, particularly the grey zone, then you can work some really extended DX. But let's talk about 160 metres for the average ham radio operator. Now, the downside of 160 metres is that you need a fairly large aerial. And a fairly large area requires a fairly large garden, and most of us, or at least many of us, haven't got large gardens. So can you still get onto 160 metres? Well, yes you can. Before I talk about antennas, let me just tell you that back when I was first licensed, we had a 10 watt power limitation, and I think that was 10 watts input power, not output. I think it was 10 watts input power to the PA was the limitation, and that was really because the 160 metre band, or very near the 160 metre band, was a lot of shipping, and in fact I think 1 or 2 shipping stations did have frequencies inside the 160 metre band, and it was a problem, or could be a problem, for causing interference. So the amateur radio operators, because they were operating near stations that were coastal stations, they were pegged down to 10 watts input. And in fact, rather interestingly, that's one of the reasons why they kept CW for a long time, because a lot of coastal stations were using CW, and if you were causing interference, they may want to tell you on CW that you were causing interference. I never actually heard of any case whatsoever of a shipping station calling a ham radio station and saying, "Hi chum, you're causing us interference." So I'm not sure whether it ever happened, but anyway, it was an interesting thought. By the way, also the 10 watt limitation was, I think was input power to the PA, which means to say you were perhaps transmitting 5 watts. It wasn't actually adhered to by many ham radio operators, and I sort of confess I was one of them. We used to run higher power, so Ofcom, if you listen, come and arrest me now. It was not uncommon to run sort of 40 or 50 watts on 160 metres, and there were 1 or 2 stations, which I won't name, which were using 1 or 2 813 PAs instead of having 4 or 500 watts on 160 metres. But there we are. That was what used to happen there. So the big problem with 160 metres is antennas, and it can be rather an interesting band. And there are still operators on 160 metres that use it for nattering and also for more serious DX operation. But it's the antenna. So let's take a look at what antennas that you can use on 160 metres from a smallish garden. The first antenna that merits consideration is an area that I stumbled across recently on a website. The website is DJ0IP, and he's published details of a doublet for 160 metres. Now the interesting thing about this doublet, believe it or not, it is only 14 metres long, so it's less than 50 feet. And he gives really detailed construction information about the antenna, particularly about the antenna matching unit, which actually is quite simple. And he says that whilst it won't compete with a full-size dipole, it does perform pretty well. Now I've put a link below this video to the website, and it's an interesting website actually, because there's a lot of construction information there about all sorts of things, but this particular antenna interested me because, well, if you can get on 160 metres and put out a reasonable signal with something that's less than 50 foot long, then it's worth considering. And so if you're thinking about going on 160 metres and you want to be a bit adventurous in terms of building your own antenna, take a look at this website because it's very interesting. There's also some other things that you can construct as well. So that's DJ0IP, and as I say, I'll put a link below this video to the website. Now, because 160 metres has got quite a strong ground wave, it's possible to radiate signals even with some fairly simple antennas. And I know that when I was first licensed, we didn't know too much about antennas, and we just used to put up lengths of wire. So a favourite really for 160 metres was always the end-fed wire. And the end-fed wire was as long as your garden. We always yearned for a garden that was 132 foot long, but it never seemed to happen in reality. And of course most of us were dependent on our parents' garden, so we didn't have much say in it. But we always laughingly said a 132 foot garden would be ideal, because that's actually a quarter wave on 160 metres. So still only half a dipole. But we in practice used to put up a wire as long as the garden was and match it with an antenna matching unit. And the way to match it was a simple L match, and that L match is still used today in many or most of the auto ATUs. And I did publish a video about the L match, and I'll put up on the screen now the circuit of an L match. It's just a variable capacitor and a variable inductor, and quite easy to make. I think in those days we made the inductor with lots of taps on it, so we could tap it with a crocodile clip, and of course the capacitor was just a variable capacitor. You can get roller coaster inductors now, but we used to just tap a coil, and that's one way of matching an end-fed wire. Now, another way of matching an end-fed wire, of course, is to use one of the commercial auto antenna tuning units, and there's a number about, particularly if you're limiting your power to 100 watts. Now, if you happen to own one of the recent Yaesu transceivers, Yaesu do something called an FC40, which is an automatic antenna tuning unit which uses the L network to obtain resonance, and it covers all bands from 160 through to 6 metres. So basically you can operate that antenna tuner on 160 metres using an end-fed wire. Now the idea is, although you've got a tuner inside your transceiver, that tuner won't match an end-fed wire. So what you do is you connect the FC40 to the back of your transceiver. I've got an FT710, which I know will take the ATU. Also got an FTX-Optima that will also take that external ATU, and some of the other modern Yaesu radios will as well. If you use that external ATU, you can attach a long wire to it, basically any length. I think there are minimum lengths, but I think for 160 metres you would need something fairly long, around about 50 or perhaps 70 or 80 feet. I think they say in the manual. But anyway, you can always bend the wire around the garden, so it's not too difficult to get 70 or 80 foot of wire out in order to operate on 160 metres. You can use shorter wires, but it won't tune on 160 metres. So for 160 metres, use a long wire. The longer the better, but 70 or 80 feet should see you there. And you need to turn off the internal antenna matching unit in your transceiver, because you don't want two ATUs working one against the other. Turn off the internal ATU in your transceiver, and then connect this FC40 to the back of your transceiver, and that will resonate your wire on 160 meters. Now, one thing you must have some sort of earth system. There's an earth terminal on this ATU, and it's designed, by the way, to go outside, so it's waterproof. You can stick it outside the window on the wall, and you have your wire going to the ATU, and also a wire going down to earth, or a counterpoise, just a sort of length of wire down the guard line on the ground. It needs to work against something. And that should give you 160 meters. Then it should actually give you some interesting contacts on 160 meters. And of course, it also will operate on all bands. I know I've never used the FC40, but I know the principle, and I have used antenna tuners in the past which use a similar principle. And they're quite magical actually, because it will resonate to that bit of wire on all bands. And it's not overly expensive. So take a look at the FC40, and again I'll try to remember to put a link below this video to the antenna tuning unit. Now, another really compact system you could use is you could actually use a 160 meter mobile whip. You could mount that near the ground, and then provide some sort of counterpoise or earth match. You need quite a few radials. I should say you need about 10 or 12 radials. Don't have to be particularly long, but just radials lying on the ground. Now, the downside of that is it's going to be very narrow banded. 160 meters is only 200 kilohertz wide, but at that frequency it's very wide in terms of antenna resonance. So with a mobile whip, you're probably not going to get a bandwidth more than about 10 or 15 kilohertz before the internal antenna tuner unit in your transceiver will run out of the ability to match it. So you need to pick your spot. With the FC40, of course, you don't. That antenna matching unit will match you anywhere on the 160 meter band. And likewise, of course, on the antenna that we opened up with DJ0IP, that of course you can move around the band because you've got an antenna matching unit there. But with a fixed resonant antenna like a 160 meter whip, it's not going to give you DX, but it may enable you to join in a local club net if the club is on 160 meters. But it's going to be narrow banded. You're going to have to make sure you resonate it on or within a very close proximity to the frequency that you want to operate on. Now, on 160 meters, there's some very keen operators that work and regularly work DX, and my brother-in-law G3OQT is a very keen operator on 160 meters. In fact, that's his main band of operation, and he regularly works DX across to the States, into the Caribbean, and during the morning, particularly morning, we've got the grey line propagation, he can work into VK and ZL if conditions are right. I think the VK and ZL openings are quite short, like sort of 10 or 15 minutes. You have to be pretty quick to take the opportunity when the band's open. He did work a ZL back in I think it was probably 1962 or 1963, and he did have a recording of it actually. ZL3RB, I may be wrong on that, but anyway, he worked ZL, and that was with a very basic war surplus army receiver and very basic transmitter, which was I think it may have been crystal controlled. No, it probably was VFO controlled, but very simple CW transmitter. And I mentioned CW because a lot of the keen operators on 160 meters operate CW, and they certainly do manage to work the DX, and it's a very popular mode on 160 meters when the band is open. Data, of course, is also present now. SSB, I'm not sure. I'm not an experienced SSB. Well, I'm not an experienced 160 meter operator, so I can only sort of tell you what I know in terms of the current operation. But I know Richard has told me, G3OQT, that he's worked all sorts of DX, and it's quite mind blowing actually what he works, because it sounds as if he's on 20 meters. You know, the stations he rolls off his work, this station and that station. But there we are. So it can be an interesting band, but also it's a nice band to have a natter. So if there's a few of you around in the club that want to try 160 meters, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how good the signals are. And you might even want to switch to AM, because I think there's still some AM on 160 metres. And AM is rather fascinating to run AM. It's got a sort of a sound of its own. And most, I think all transceivers these days have got the AM mode. You won't get so much power out. They're usually limited to around about 25 watts. But it's still an interesting mode to operate. So that's a club project, perhaps, to try 160 metres. If you've probably got a transceiver that covers 160. If you've got an auto ATU, such as the FC40 or any other auto ATU that's designed for an end-fed wire, then you're really ready to go. So, food for thought. So I'm not sure whether I've encouraged you to go on 160 metres. That wasn't really the point of this video. It's just to sort of talk about the possibilities. You decide whether you want to go on 160 metres or not. But it's an interesting band. As usual, thank you for your support on this channel. It's much appreciated. And don't forget to press the subscribe button, because that just indicates that we're, how well we're doing the right thing, and that you're sort of watching the videos, or you're keen on more videos like this. So, and also don't forget to put the comments below this video. Got any comments and tips? You can always give tips on this below the video to others that will watch the video and read the comments. So if you've got any bright ideas, particularly really about the video in question, then please put them there. In the meantime, you take care, enjoy ham radio, look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.